Hello, and welcome to a special emergency edition of Other Voices Online, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. The emergency, of course, is the sudden outbreak of violence between Israel and Palestine, the worst fighting in over 7 years. Already, more than 200 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli bombs, including dozens of children, and at least 10 Israelis have died as a result of rockets fired by Hamas. To help us understand what's happening and why, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Joel Beinin, a frequent guest on Other Voices. Joel is the Donald J. McLachlan Professor of History and Professor of Middle East History, Emeritus, at Stanford University. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Michigan in 1982 before coming to Stanford in 1983. From 2006 to 2008, he served as Director of Middle East Studies and Professor of History at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. In 2002, he served as President of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. Joel's research and writing focus on the social and cultural history and political economy of modern Egypt, Palestine, and Israel, and on U.S. policy in the Middle East. He's written or edited 12 books, most recently, A Critical Political Economy of the Middle East and North Africa, published last year by Stanford University Press. Joel, welcome back to Other Voices Online. Thank you for making the time to join us.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
As we were saying before we went on the air, we've done this far too often, it seems, the same routine. But here we are again, 7 years after the last major blow up in 2014, which actually almost 2 months, as I recall, and a couple thousand Palestinians died. In most of these incidences, like the last one in 2014, Joe Biden and a lot of politicians in Washington, their first response is, I support Israel's right to defend itself, as if all of this started with Hamas, for some unknown reason, firing missiles into Israel. Even the New York Times managed to run a little better headline on it in yesterday's paper, 4 weeks on path to war, from raid on a mosque to Middle East carnage. Can we go through some recent history and what has led to this rise in tensions and now flat out fighting between the two sides?
Sure. So even though for the last week, the focal point has been Gaza, actually, this round began in Jerusalem and in two specific spots in Jerusalem. One in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood to the north of the old city of Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. And there, since 1972, groups of settlers have been trying to evict 28 Palestinian families from their homes. Those families were originally refugees who were settled in those homes as a result of an agreement between the Jordanian government and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is responsible for taking care of the refugees. And this has gone through many legal battles. And in 2002, the first two families were evicted. There were more legal battles. In 2006, they came back, but then 4 families were evicted again in 2006, and a few more families in 2008-9. And then earlier this year, the court decided that there were altogether 14 families that would be evicted, some of them by early March and the others by August. When that decision came down, the solidarity demonstrations, which have been going on since most of this time, in which both Palestinians and Israeli Jews demonstrate in front of the neighborhood. The solidarity demonstrations intensified. There were clashes with the right-wing settlers who are extremely violent and just openly racist. The police, of course, support the settlers. So as that was heating up, the month of Ramadan began in the middle of April. And for reasons that are totally unclear, the Israeli police decided that they would set up barriers in the plaza in front of the Damascus gate of the old city, which is the gate on the north side of the city. And that's the spot where, after breaking the fast of Ramadan, people would gather and socialize, and not to do anything particular, just to hang out and have a little party now that they can eat. So the Israeli,
yeah, it's a joyful time, right?
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Friendly. It's a party.
Yeah, as people prepare special food and so on. So Israeli authorities decide that that's too disruptive, and no, they're not going to allow it. And there was a 2-month struggle, which resulted in the Israeli police backing off and removing the barriers. But almost as if they were angry at being forced to retreat, then they said, oh, well, we're going to limit the number of people that can pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque sits on the same spot as the ancient Jewish temple. So it's a holy spot for both Jews and Muslims. It's the third holiest site in Islam. And typically during Ramadan, thousands of people would come to pray there, well over 10,000. So on the last Friday of Ramadan, which is the biggest single day of prayer for Ramadan, the police said, okay, we're limiting the number of people who can come because it'll be disruptive and so forth. And they blocked cars from coming from the north. People got out of their cars and started walking. They carried out the prayer. And after the prayer, there were scuffles, and people who were at prayer threw rocks and things at the police, and there was a big fight, and 250 Palestinians were arrested. On Monday, that is a week ago today, was Jerusalem Day. That's the day when the most virulent racist right-wingers parade with Israeli flags through the old city of Jerusalem, do all sorts of provocative and violent things to Palestinians, basically to assert Jewish supremacy in the city. So because
can you tell us the significance of Jerusalem Day, what it commemorates?
So it is meant to commemorate the reunification of Jerusalem, which happened in the wake of the 1967 war between Israel and the Arab states. And immediately after the war, Israel applied administrative unity to the city. And then in 1980, Israel officially announced it is annexing East Jerusalem, which only the Trump administration and a few other American sycophants recognize. So the Muslims barricaded themselves in the mosque to prepare for being assaulted on Jerusalem Day. And the Israeli authorities did divert the demonstration so that it didn't directly clash but with the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. But then they decided this would be a good time to attack the mosque again. So they did, and 300 more people were arrested. Hamas then announced, if the Israeli security forces don't evacuate the Al-Aqsa compound by 6 p.m. on Monday, we're going to unleash rockets against Israel. Well, Israel is not going to do whatever because Hamas said they should do it. So, okay, game on. Hamas sent 7 rockets, a relatively modest response, which did no damage, but they were sent in the direction of Jerusalem, which is a pretty far reach. And that was a sign that Hamas can reach places that it never could reach before with its rockets. And the Israelis responded at first with a moderately large and then with a massive bombardment, which has not ceased.
And what is the deeper motivation here? We know that they want to claim all of Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel. Donald Trump was playing along with that. We have a new administration in here that does not recognize, well, I'm not sure the status of U.S.
They
recognition.
have not rescinded Trump's recognition of Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem.
He could still, but it has not officially been rescinded yet. So I know you sent me an article that you're hoping to get published, and the title I think is pretty telling. Jerusalem and the displacement of Palestinians are the core issues. So let's talk about the real core issues and not just the Jerusalem Day marches. And this is something much deeper and longer lasting and actually a long-term goal of Israel, I think.
Right. So when Israel effectively annexed East Jerusalem on June 28th, 1967, it was very clear from day one that every government, the labor governments, the Likud governments, all of them had the intention to permanently annex East Jerusalem. Now, not just East Jerusalem as it was under Jordanian rule from 1949 to 1967, but 70 square kilometers added to the municipal area of East Jerusalem before the war, which includes about 24 Palestinian villages. And they set about immediately in 1968 with building exclusively Jewish neighborhoods to surround the Arab East Jerusalem, and then another wider circle of Jewish neighborhoods to surround the east side of what they call Greater Jerusalem. So this has been a high priority agenda item for every single Israeli government since the end of the 1967 war. At one point in 2004, the master plan for Jerusalem said, we want to limit the Palestinian population of Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, including East and West, to 30%. But the Palestinian population increase has blown through that, and the Palestinians are probably now closer to 40% of the population in Jerusalem, which is dangerously close to a majority. So there has been, especially in the period since Netanyahu came back to power in 2009, full-on press to push Palestinians out, to set up new neighborhoods, and to install in some of the neighborhoods are just like normal folk who they got a good mortgage and they got a bigger apartment and they don't have any political agenda. But some of the settlers are hardcore right-wingers who commit violence on their Arab neighbors on a regular basis. And they invite in their allies from the more distant settlements in the West Bank, where they are also hardcore religious nationalists. And so the level of violence and the tension has been escalating. And there have been a number of different moments, say in the year or two before this latest round, where things could easily have gotten to be the way they are now.
We mentioned Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital. Has that played into what we're seeing now? Did that help drive this momentum forward, that Netanyahu would now feel emboldened to make such a move at this point?
Well, we should be clear that Netanyahu, and again, all the other Israeli governments, although perhaps his governments in a more concerted way, they were going to do this anyway. This was an Israeli Zionist national mission. And there is very little dissent in Israel over the principle that Jerusalem will be Jewish. 10–15% of the Israeli Jewish population would be prepared to share it with a Palestinian state, which looks almost like it's impossible for that to ever happen now. certainly Trump's recognition emboldened Netanyahu. Not only Trump, the American ambassador to Israel under Trump, David Friedman, was a personal contributor to one of the most extreme religious seminaries in the northern West Bank settlement. Jared Kushner's family also contributed to settler projects. So between Kushner and Friedman, Trump probably didn't know any of the details of any of this. They were the ones
right.
framing the policy. But these guys are annexationists. They support the settler right wing. So they're giving every other day another green light to do this or that. And Biden administration comes in, and both Biden and Kamala Harris are longtime supporters of Israel, not in the same outrageous, openly racist way as the Trump administration, perhaps, but effectively there isn't any real difference. And Biden's got a domestic agenda that he needs to deal with. If he doesn't fix the economy, the Democrats won't retain their majorities in Congress, and there will be no chance for a Democrat to be elected president in 2024. So his radar is focused laser-like on COVID and the economy and infrastructure and jobs, which is actually, I think, correct. And he would rather that this just go away, that no, don't bother me with this. But since he has to respond because it blew up in his face, he says stupid things like, I don't see that Israel has responded disproportionately, which is, idiotic.
Yes. Anybody can see that these are not proportional responses. There's a couple other dynamics within Israeli politics and society, I think, that may come in here. One is the ongoing struggle to form a new coalition government. And Netanyahu was out of that process, and other folks were actually on the verge of possibly successfully forming a new coalition government that would not include Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister. Can you talk about that aspect of it and how that might play into this dynamic?
Right. So my family in Israel are convinced, and many Israelis along with them, they're not peculiar in this regard. The media is speculating about this, that the escalation that began earlier this month was, if not exactly planned, pushed by Netanyahu to make it more difficult for right-wing elements to enter the counter coalition that would have displaced him as prime minister, because two of the parties that would have come into that coalition are more right-wing than Netanyahu himself. Not more right-wing than the most outrageous Kahanist elements that he would have brought into his coalition, but more right-wing than he himself. Because Netanyahu, hard as it is to believe, is the most moderate person in the Likud, which tells you something about the direction of Israeli politics. So once there's a war, and that coalition would have had to depend on the votes of 4 Palestinian Arab Knesset members, citizens of Israel. So once there's a war, no, the right-wingers do not want to depend on Arab votes, because that's not even legitimate in right-wing eyes to begin with. And of course, the Jews have to close ranks. And it, at this point, looks like Netanyahu has successfully foiled the effort to form this counter coalition. Was that his intention all along? So I discussed that with some colleagues in the United States who are not under fire, but who follow the situation closely as I do. And they said, no, it's a little bit too conspiratorial. I mean, maybe the Israeli government just miscalculated. They didn't think that Hamas was going to respond in the way they did. And that, of course, is normal, because people who have power often think that people who are weaker than them will simply submit. And quite often they don't simply submit, and that
Right.
they changes the calculus of the game. So no one could have figured all of that out in advance is the counter to the more conspiratorial explanation. There's also a domestic politics element on the Palestinian side. There were supposed to be Palestinian elections later this month. And in the run-up to those elections, it was apparent that Mahmoud Abbas was very likely to lose. There were splits in Fatah, and either a counter slate within Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah party or Hamas looked like they were going to win a majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council. So he canceled the elections with the tacit approval of Israel and the United States. So, of course, Palestinians are, well, what is that? I mean, and especially Hamas, of course, as well. You did that to just keep us out of power, so we're going to get you.
Yeah. And then there's the added complication, and I don't know if this plays into it at all. I guess it's another part of the conspiratorial aspect. Netanyahu himself facing rather serious criminal charges.
Right. So the reason that Israeli politics has been in such an uproar for the last 2 years, there have been 4 different elections in Israel in the last 2 years, is that Netanyahu has been indicted on 3 different charges of corruption. And in fact, the trial actually began several weeks ago. The trial is going to last for a very, very long time. It is not going to be resolved anytime soon. So what Netanyahu has been trying to do is to form a government that will agree that he can continue to serve as prime minister, even though he's been indicted. And then he'll do the legal maneuvers for years and years and years. And who knows, maybe he'll reach retirement age before he's actually convicted. The opposition bloc, how did this weird opposition bloc, which contains people who are to the right of Netanyahu plus communists, how did such a bizarre opposition bloc form? Is basically people who hate Netanyahu and want him out of there.
The so-called, the Israeli equivalent of the anti-Trump coalition, anybody but Trump, basically.
Very comparable, very comparable.
Anybody but Netanyahu. Let's turn our attention to some of the supposed diplomatic efforts that are going on to whatever level they may be happening. I understand Biden spoke with Netanyahu today and expressed support for a ceasefire, but is not pushing on Netanyahu to engage in a ceasefire. Bring back to 2014, the last time there was a major blow up, it went on for 2 months. What are the various diplomatic elements going on, whether it's with the UN, with neighboring countries like Egypt and Jordan weighing in? Can you?
So calling for a ceasefire is the equivalent of sending our thoughts and prayers to the victims of the mass shootings that happen regularly in this country. It's totally meaningless.
Well put.
Totally meaningless. Because even if there were actually today a total ceasefire, what does that mean? The people of Gaza are back to living in rubble and under siege in an open air prison with limited water and electricity and 60% unemployment for youth and dependent on international charity from Qatar to survive, and of course the United Nations as well. But plus the occupation continues in the West Bank. 14 people in the West Bank have been killed by Israel over the last week, and a few cases in collaboration with the Palestinian Authority, which doesn't want to see solidarity demonstrations with the people of Gaza. So calling for return to the status quo ante basically is, well, let's go back to a less visible form of violence. This is too visible.
Right.
To say nothing of the fact that actually, as you sent me the article from the Washington Post earlier today, on Monday, the administration approved the sale of $735 million of precision-guided missiles to Israel, which are very high-powered devices. And one of them was actually used in blowing up the Jalal Tower, which had the offices of the Associated Press and Al Jazeera and other media outlets, which Anthony Blinken expressed concern about. Okay, big deal. So he's concerned. Then what did he do with his concern? And Congress has until Thursday, I believe it is, to register an objection. I don't think they can actually overturn it because the money has been appropriated. But that's between today and Thursday. There isn't even enough time, even if Congress was inclined, which the majority of Congress is not inclined, to block this arms sale. But it's only something like that which would make Israel stand up and take notice.
Yeah, that is one of the places where the U.S. has some leverage, the $3.8 billion that we send them every year, and this current request for $735 million in additional smart bombs, basically. Do you see any chance of a change in the tone or nature of the debate within Congress? I imagine there will be some people who will try to take the opportunity, this arms sale, which will go through unless Congress passes a resolution of dissent about it. They did that with several arms sales during the Trump administration, direct Saudi Arabia, and they actually did disapprove of those, and Trump vetoed the congressional effort. But I'm just wondering, since we suddenly find ourselves with an arms sale to Israel in the midst of all this violence, if there might at least be some small faction in Congress who can make some progress in bringing the debate about how much money we send to Israel and what Israel does with that military support that we send them, i.e. attack Gaza Strip.
So we should backtrack a moment because it's not an arms sale. I may have misspoken. It's a gift. It's military, it's freebie. So the real beneficiary in the end are American arms industries. We buy with our tax money the stuff from Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, et cetera, and we give it to Israel.
An important distinction. Thank you.
Everyone should watch the video of Rashida Tlaib's speech to the House of Representatives, which was shown in full on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Program last week.
I linked that in our email announcing this program, as a matter of fact.
First of all, no one has ever addressed Congress in those terms ever before on this question. And secondly, she isn't alone. The Squad and Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman and Mondaire Jones and Bernie Sanders wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. So first he wrote it and second the Times published it. And the Times has some excellent reporting on what's going on. I mean, normally I really I'm repelled by what the Times says, but Patrick Kingsley is the relatively new bureau chief in Jerusalem, and he's been a breath of fresh air as compared to their previous reporting. So there has definitely been a shift in opinion in the United States. The base of the Democratic Party does not accept the knee-jerk pro-Israelism of people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, even Bob Menendez, who is been one of the biggest Israel boosters in Congress, said that he was very concerned about bombing journalists and civilians. The Jallah building, the 14-story tower that Israel bombed. Now, expressing concern, again, it's not very big deal, but for someone who has been one of the largest recipients of AIPAC-directed funding in Congress and who has never criticized Israel before, and he happens to be chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so not an insignificant person when he speaks out on this, there's been a change. Is it enough to change US government policy? No, not yet.
But it's progress, I guess,
Yes.
after all these years. So we should probably turn to our audience. We have a very large audience tonight. I imagine there's a lot of questions. So if you do have a question, what we do is bring you on as a panelist for a while. So raise your hand. We have TD, our usual TV director, is behind the scenes, so he'll bring you on. What you'll see when you come on to join us on screen is Zoom will actually disappear briefly from your screen. And when it comes back on, you will need to start your video and audio again, because it'll mute you and turn off your video, and Zoom won't allow us to turn it on without your permission. So if we're ready to start having some people coming on, we can see who we've got coming on. And I see, I seem to be the only one with the hand up so far, but we are ready for any of your questions or comments. This is a conversation. We do allow comments, but since we have so many people, please keep your comments or any questions as terse and quickly as possible. And I guess while we're waiting for somebody, well, we do have someone on here, Evelyn Roca. Okay.
Hi, yes, I'm not sure if
Evelyn,
anybody
what's your
else,
question?
I'm not sure if anybody else already asked, but what is a call to action? What is the, well, aside from electoral politics, you just mentioned, I'm not sure if you're wanting to speak to that.
So first of all, May 15th was the anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe when over 700,000 Palestinians were turned into refugees and either fled or evicted from their homes in historic Palestine. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of demonstrations throughout this country. And if I'm not on May 15th, and if I'm not mistaken, there's another call for demonstrations later this week. I don't remember the details because they're all being done locally. But this was notable, I think, because I have never seen such large-scale demonstrations in solidarity with the Palestinian people. So it's not just in Congress, but it's also the American people are beginning to wake up.
I think another call to action would be when in one of our emails announcing this program, we encourage people for the first time in 4 years to actually contact the White House. I think Joe Biden and some of the Democrats do need to hear from those of us who support Palestinian rights that we're out here and ready to hold the party in power responsible for what's happening with our foreign aid money. So I would encourage you to do that. There is this question, the arms transfer that's coming up, so you could contact your own congressional representative and senators and encourage them to oppose this arms transfer. There may not even be a resolution introduced to stop it, but Congress needs to hear from us as well right now also. So in terms of a call to action, I think there are plenty of things we can do there, and we're always watching for things where we can raise our voices together on policies like this. So let's turn to Norma Harris, who has joined us. Norma, what's your question?
I don't have any questions. I have a lot of answers. I've been an admirer of Joel Beinin for 40 years or however long. I know, whatever it is. It's a long time. I have posted some comments that I'm inviting people to take a look at. They're lengthy, and I'm not going to read them to you. They're in my line of saying a bunch of gangs are again roaming against the people who have been abused for the past 73 years. And they just continue to do it with impunity, with the excuse, oh, Israel has the right to defend itself. Oh, there was one thing I wanted to say that I'm losing in the midst of all the other things that I have in mind here. Mine is a great defense against the imperialist invasion that caused the settlement of people against people who had been living there forever with their olive trees and their pomegranate trees, and being told that they hadn't treated the land properly and they didn't live properly, so they had to get out or be bombed and murdered. And all of this, I could be called anti-Semitic, except I've grown up Jewish and I'm very committed. I've always been Jewish, and that's been a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I don't practice Jewish religion, except that I'm a deep communist. So just the addition, people could read those things and maybe get inspired. Oh, I know what it was. It is to excuse the idea that if you talk about the terrible behavior that has created this Israel that needs to go, Israel needs to end. That terrible behavior that is created is not anti-Semitic. And I want to give the space, the platform to be able to say that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for your comments. We do have people lined up here. In terms of various resources, including links that might be in chat, and I noticed somebody earlier put on chat asking about a link to the Rashida Tlaib video. We do send out an additional resources email to everybody who attends these webinars. We get your email address from your registration. We do send out a lot of follow-up links, so we will watch your email over the next couple of days. We send that out when the video of this program is posted to our YouTube channel, so that you can share that with folks as well. So thank you very much, Norma, and we'll turn now to
Cornelius posted a nice note in the chat. So why didn't anybody ask why the Palestinians, Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? Anyway.
Indeed they do. I'm going to move on to our next audience member here, Carolyn Scarr.
Oh, Paul, and hello, Joel.
Hi, Carolyn.
Thank you so much for putting this on. What I'm interested in a little bit more of is history. What is the historical relationship between Zionism and European and American empire? Has there been some international politic interest in maintaining and establishing Israel as a toehold for European and American empire and imperialism? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Carolyn. That's actually a much more complicated question than it sounds like. Because yes, of course, when the British government in 1917 issued the Balfour Declaration saying that His Majesty's government views with favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. From the point of view of the British government, that was part of their imperial project. They were thinking in part that they're going to have a dependent population, and they're thinking primarily of white European Jews, not the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, who mostly were not Zionists anyway. In fact, most Jews were not Zionists before the rise of Hitler altogether. So yes, the British had that imperial project. On the other hand, that's not when the Zionist movement began. The Zionist movement began in the 19th century, and it began in response to a wave of pogroms and oppression in the Russian Empire, where Jews were persecuted miserably. And most of those Jews chose to come to the United States. The great majority of the American Jewish community is descended from that wave of some 2 million immigrants from the Russian Empire and other places in Eastern Europe. But some small percentage at first, and then after the rise of Hitler, larger numbers of Jews decided Palestine is the place, especially because in 1924, the United States changed its immigration laws, and Eastern Europeans, including Eastern European Jews, were no longer allowed to come in significant numbers. So Zionism has this dual character from early on as a national liberation project for Eastern European Jews at first, and as a British imperial project. When the State of Israel was established, both the United States and the Soviet Union, this is very important, both the United States and the Soviet Union even more forcefully than the United States, supported the establishment of the State of Israel. The State of Israel would not have survived the invasion of the surrounding Arab states, which began the day it was established on May 15th, 1948, if it had not been for arms that came from Czechoslovakia and other Soviet bloc countries. And people like David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, have acknowledged that. The United States, although it supported the establishment of the State of Israel, was very cool about it. Why? Because the principal American interest in the Middle East at that point was oil. And the Arab oil producing countries did not support Zionism. And most of the executives of Aramco, what's today ExxonMobil, Chevron, Texaco, they were sympathetic to their Arab hosts and anti-Semitic to boot, many of them. So, and in 1956, when Israel attacked in alliance with Britain and France, Egypt, and took over the Sinai Peninsula, the Eisenhower administration said forthwith, you withdraw right now. And surprise, they did, which tells you what could happen if the United States actually wanted something to happen. It wasn't until after the '67 war that Israel actually became a regional ally and client of the American empire. And that relationship has developed since then with different flavors to it. First, as a Cold War alliance, after the collapse of the Soviet Union as an alliance in the global war on terror, where Israeli intelligence has been very, very important factor because the United States does not have, typically speaking, good Middle East intelligence. And then more recently, with Israel's efforts to scuttle the Iran nuclear deal and try to promote the idea that Iran is the biggest threat to the peace and stability of the region. Iran is certainly not a good guy in this story, but neither are they the biggest threat to the peace and stability of the region. Israel arguably is that. So there is an imperial story here for sure, but there's also a little twist that often we don't think about. Why did most of the international left support the establishment of the State of Israel? Well, first of all, those who followed the Soviet Union did it because the Soviet Union said so. But more broadly, people like Eleanor Roosevelt and the whole panoply of the left liberal camp in the United States post-World War II. They were very strong Zionists. Why? Because the European Jews were the victims of Nazi fascism, and the West did not come to their aid, and there was a sense of guilt and so on. And people like Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, above and beyond the money that they get from AIPAC, that's a factor in their thinking. So I don't think that excuses anything whatsoever. It's just a factor that we need to bring into the equation when we think about what's going on there.
Thank you for the excellent question, Carolyn, and thank you for encapsulated important history, Joel. Let's turn now to Eden. Eden, it looks like your audio is still muted. Okay,
yeah,
what's your
sorry.
question? That's
Hi.
okay. Welcome.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Joel, Ben, and I am also a fan, and I think I'm part of a group called Speak Out Now. We're a revolutionary socialist group in the Bay, mostly centered in the Bay Area. And we've had you speak before for us, so I really appreciated that. And actually still watch the video many times and share it with people to talk about the Egyptian revolution. But I guess my question is partial question, partial comment, more about this question that people keep re-raising or discussing about what we really need to do, and what's really going to end this thing that has, I mean, what we're talking about right now, I've been active as an activist for at least 10 years now, and this is not the first time we've talked about, you know, the brutalization of the Palestinian people. And I think we're talking a little bit about, you know, going to a protest or, you know, trying to call politicians, trying to block one sort of trade arms deal or another. But these all seem to me to be really like a drop of water in an ocean. You know, this is really a much bigger, deeper problem. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about it as the system as a whole. You know, how do we stop this going on for another 10, 15, 20 years? I have my perspective, you know, I think we need a global transformation, a completely different system. But I wanted to hear more what you thought about that, not just what we could do in the short term, but really as a long-term solution to this problem. We need to transform the whole system.
So global transformation would be great, but objectively speaking, the left is weak globally. And we need to acknowledge that and take that in and understand how that came to be, because it can't be changed unless we understand why it is the way it is now. And I'm not going to give you a big discussion about that, but that's a baseline. So I don't think anything is going to be dramatically changed in the next 10 or 15 years. I don't expect this problem to be resolved in my lifetime, in my son's lifetime, hopefully. In your lifetime, hopefully. You look like you're young enough to live long enough to see it. With the acknowledgement that the left is globally weak, that's not to say that nothing has happened. So even back in 2014, longshoremen at the port of Oakland refused to load an Israeli ship. 2 days ago, longshoremen in Italy refused to load an Israeli ship. So there are very powerful actions which don't amount to an overall radical change, but which build the power of workers and others who have an interest in a radical change. That's where we are now. I've been working on this issue, oh my God, for 50 years, really. When I began to work on it, I never imagined that things could be as terrible as they are now. That said, I was so uplifted by Rashida Tlaib's speech. And she made her colleagues listen to her, whether or not they agreed with her. So the beginning is having a platform to say something which is remotely approximates the truth. And we do have that now. It's not just the New York Times, Newsweek, the Washington Post, of course, Amy Goodman and Democracy Now!, and lots of other media outlets have had very good reporting on this situation. That did not used to be the case. I mean, you're maybe too young to remember when there was no place in the English-speaking media where you could get decent information about this. So I'm sorry to say that the change is not likely to be very quick, but we should also remember that sometimes things change unexpectedly very quickly. If you had asked people who are supposed to know, like people in the CIA, 3 years before the Soviet Union collapsed, is the Soviet Union likely to collapse anytime soon? No, no chance, no chance, no chance. So we can't predict those kinds of major moments of rupture. The United States is an empire in decline. That's not even a controversial idea once you get out of the Washington Beltway. The people who are voting for Trump are saying that in a certain way. Make America great again. That means we're less great than we used to be, even
Right.
by implication that may be not exactly what they meant to say, but it is what they're saying. So the United States is an empire in decline. I remember saying that at one of the very first forums that I spoke at after Miriam, my partner, and I returned from living in Cairo for a few years in 2008. Well, it was true then. It's true now. I didn't mean then that the decline is happening next week or next month or next year, and I don't mean it now, but the decline is underway. How that's going to turn out, we can't know. How is this going to affect the situation in Israel and Palestine? Well, China is already a major factor in the Middle East. They aren't deploying diplomatic and certainly not military clout at this point, but their interest in the region is oil. Unfortunately, they wouldn't be consuming all those fossil fuels, but they are. And at a certain point, they may start to push their weight around. So that can be a factor. If the Iran nuclear deal is restored, which Biden actually wants to do, and if Iran becomes reintegrated into the region, that will have an impact on the balance of forces regionally. So there are all sorts of things that could happen, which are far short of a radical revolutionary change, which could make a difference. And as for a radical revolutionary change, we're going to keep working on it.
Indeed, we are. That's what I was going to say. Just keep working on it.
Definitely.
Definitely. Thank you, Eden. Excellent question. Let's turn now to, did we just lose Alice Smith? She's been waiting there so long. I saw, Alice, are you online? I think we've, well, we had another questioner and they have disappeared, so.
Maybe Eden's dog wants to ask a question.
Yeah, well, no, Eden, hi, what's the dog's name, by the way? We need to put him in the credits.
It's Rue. She
Okay,
said hi.
Rue. Okay. Well, I don't see any more hands up. Right. Oh, here we go.
Hi.
This is an email address. What's your name?
My name is Kifaya.
Kifalia. Okay. What's your question?
So before the question, I want to talk about an observation as a Palestinian in the US academia. So I watched the Palestinian resistance activism, what Hamas was able, despite the siege, to be able to make power that would speak to Israel or would be threatening to Israel. So there are some lessons to be learned from this. And I'm talking about the arrogant West and the Western academia that's always thinking of Palestinians and Arabs as subordinates, as savages, as the third world to be rescued. So there are actually lessons to be learned here. And we're talking about the West, we're talking about the US, who still are a very racist country with the Black Lives Matter. There's much to be done. So I wonder if you would speak about what kind of lessons the West can learn from what's going on now in Palestine.
So that's a very complicated question, because I don't think I'm the only one who would say that armed struggle is not a way for the Palestinians to prevail. It's a tactic of desperation, and it's a very risky tactic, because every time that Hamas uses it, people in Gaza suffer horribly, which has nothing to do with people's right to resist. People do have a right to resist. I don't contest that whatsoever. It's a question of what's efficacious, and also targeting civilians when both sides do it, and both sides do certainly do it, is not something that I feel comfortable supporting. You put the focus on American academia, which is a two-headed animal on this question. On the one hand, university campuses are the most significant place where there is an open discussion of Israel-Palestine. You have lots of Palestinian, Arab, Muslim professors. You've got people like me who are not Palestinian, Arab, or Muslim, teaching Middle East studies. The atmosphere on campus is totally different than it was.
Disagree with this.
Well,
I have to disagree with this because
I don't think you've been around long enough. The problem is that if you see what's happened in the last 10 years, then what you see is a huge attack on people who have spoken up for Palestine. And people have certainly taken big hits, Stephen Salaita, Norman Finkelstein, other people like that. Okay, those are a few people. And also, people who are not tenured are frightened, and quite reasonably so, because Canary Mission has attacked them and so forth and so on. But I have a dozen students, just me, who are professors in American universities. When I came to Stanford, there were not a dozen professors in the entire country who spoke, researched, wrote, and taught from a perspective that was supportive of Palestinian rights. So there has been a huge change. Part of the counterattack and the viciousness of the counterattack is because of that change. So you can't begin the story from, oh, they are attacking us and limiting our academic freedom and freedom of speech, which they are, to be sure. But they are doing that because they're on the defensive now. Now, that doesn't address the broader question of the framework of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment, which is very, very widespread in the United States, and most obviously among the supporters of President Trump, who are exactly not the people who hang out at American universities and colleges. There is a gap, which is not to say, again, that everybody on every university is sympathetic to Palestinian rights. That is certainly not the case. But this is the part of America that I know the best. And the change has been astonishing. It's taken a long time. As Paul said when he introduced me, I came to Stanford in 1983. Now I'm retired. So I didn't succeed in turning Stanford upside down in the time I spent there. But there was no Students for Justice in Palestine. There was no Jewish Voice for Peace. The Stanford Student Union hadn't passed a resolution supporting boycotts, investment sanctions. All of that came only in the last 10 years or so, really since 2014.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, before I turn to any more questioners, I need to check in here. Normally, we try to keep these webinars to 1 hour because the Community Media Center still broadcasts our programs on local television, and we're supposed to be at 1 hour to match their schedule. But I'm happy to run over a little bit, but I first have to ask my guest, Joel Beinin, whether you can go a few more minutes. I told you this would go to 7. We're at 7:02 right now. Do you have a few more minutes and we'll get in these?
I could go for another 10 minutes or so, yeah.
Okay, so Alice Smith is back, and let's try to be quick, everyone.
Yes, no, my question is, I've been a member of J Street for many years, and I'm when I went to Palestine in December before COVID, I was absolutely shocked by the infrastructure or the lack thereof in Jerusalem and Bethlehem and some of the areas where Palestinians were. And I wonder if you could comment, is there ever a chance for a two-state solution?
So that's a question that comes up a lot. And I think the question is out of place for two reasons. First, I won't say there is no chance whatsoever. How would I be able to predict such a thing? I would say that the chances are asymptotically approaching zero very rapidly. The other reason why the question is out of place is that saying that there needs to be a two-state solution and that there needs to be a negotiated process between Israel and the Palestinians has become a propaganda point whose effect, if not its purpose, I think, because many people who advocate this are sincere, but its effect is to perpetuate the occupation. Why? Because not only does the current Israeli government not want two states, it's been very, very clear about that. Not only are there not any negotiations at all, nor have there been since 2014, but no government can be elected in Israel that would support two states. The Jewish population of Israel has shifted so far to the right that there are today 12, maybe 15 members of Knesset Jews, because Arabs don't count in the Jewish political calculus, racist as that is, 12 to 15 Jewish members of the Knesset who support two states. Okay, what if the United States came in there and really said, no, you're going to have to do it? There are now more than 600,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Removing any significant number of them would be a total trauma for Israel. Even governments which would like, in principle, to have a two-state solution would be very hard-pressed to do that. So I don't think there's going to be very likely a two-state solution, which does not mean that there will be a one-state solution. No, that's not very likely either. What's most likely going forward is a continuation of the status quo, miserable as it is. In the long run, I would say First of all, I don't care how many states there are. I don't think the number of states or any states solves any problems. Going forward, I would say there are some principles that we should embrace. One principle, there are two peoples who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and neither one of them is going anywhere. So they are going to live together. And if they're going to live together, then they have to live together on the basis of equality, on the basis of some restorative justice for the Palestinian refugees, which will certainly involve at least partial return. Obviously, that would be negotiated. It will require full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. There are 65 laws on the books that discriminate against them. It will require a rollback of the colonial apartheid situation, which both Human Rights Watch and the Israeli Human Rights Organization, B'Tselem, have recently said is in effect in that area. And probably nobody should be made to move. A settler who went to a settlement in the Etzion block south of Jerusalem in 1968, well, they have grandchildren who were born there now. So it's not particularly just to move them. It certainly wasn't just to move the Palestinians either. So Palestinians can come back and settlers can stay, and some arrangement politically to accommodate all that has to happen. There are Israelis and Palestinians who are thinking about these things. There is a group called A Land for All and several others who talk about variations of confederations and so forth. I don't think it's our business to talk about that, frankly. I think our business is end the occupation. The United States and the Democratic Party are not going to bring about a two-state solution. That's the fundamental flaw in J Street's thinking, I think.
Thank you for that. We have time for one more. So if Kyle will unmute yourself and get your question in as quick as you can.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'll keep it short. Thanks so much for the presentation. Just my quick question was, as someone who's kind of dedicated your career to studying political developments and movements in the Middle East, what significance do you think it has when the Palestinian people rise up and connections that oppressed and marginalized people in the rest of the Arab world, might feel and what it might provoke in terms of the whole region?
So there's a dichotomy here. On the one hand, the vast majority of the people throughout the Arab world support the rights of the Palestinian people and are in some way or another in solidarity with them. On the other hand, we've seen since the Trump administration time a big shift in Arab states, and autocratic Arab states, to be clear, for the most part. The one exception is, partial exception is Sudan, are normalizing relations with Israel. So Israel is very happy to normalize relations with countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, which are absolute monarchies. Nobody asked the people of those countries if they support normalizing relations with Israel, or in fact, nobody ever asked them anything because there are no political parties, there are no elections, there's no free press. So those are the forces in the Arab world that are aligned with Israel. Morocco, too, is a monarchy. It's not as absolute a monarchy as Saudi Arabia, but it's hardly a democracy. Why are these states, and Egypt, too, which is not a monarchy, but is also a Praetorian dictatorship, why are these states aligned with Israel? Because Israel, along with the United States, actually, is part of a Sunni front against Iran. So that doesn't have to do with anybody's rights, certainly not the Palestinians' rights. It doesn't have to do with any kind of democracy or stability. It has to do with the obsession that the United States has had since the Iranian Revolution of 1979 in trying to roll back that revolution, which has been unsuccessful.
So thank you for that question. I think we're going to have to let it go there. Just as a reminder to folks, once again, we do send out a follow-up email to everyone who attended today, whether they were here for 5 minutes or the full hour and a quarter. And that will include a link to the recording of this program. We put it up on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to share it with other people. Any links that look good that have been shared in the chats, we'll include that in the email. And I'll consult with our guest Joel here about any other links that we could send out to you that would be of interest to follow up on this topic. I do want to thank that we have set a new record for attendance at this. Somehow we got over our 100-person license. We maxed out at 103 people. I don't know how we did that, but it's been great. Joel Beinin, retired professor of Middle East history at Stanford University. Joel, it's been great to see you, and thank you for joining us again. And
Thank you, Paul.
And I always say the biggest problem with Zoom is I can't walk my guest out to the parking lot after we're done. So I'll say goodbye now, and thanks again. And we'll see you all online sometime soon. Thanks for attending. Take care.